Hi, my name is Rowick Calvane. I buried my wife on a Thursday. By Friday morning, her family showed up at my apartment in Millbrook Heights with cardboard boxes and smug expressions, expecting to find a broken man ready to disappear quietly into whatever corner poor people crawl into when the money runs out. They had no idea that 3 months before Evelisse died, she'd transferred everything. The lakeside estate in Thornwick Bay, the investment portfolio worth $8.2 million, and the pharmaceutical patent royalties that generated 6 figures annually, directly into my name with legal documents they'd never bothered to read. Because here's what they forgot. You can't humiliate someone who was quietly building an empire while you were busy counting other people's money. And what happened next wasn't grief. It was a reckoning that turned their assumptions into legal nightmares. Stick around. You'll want to see how fast arrogance crumbles when inheritance papers don't match the fantasy you've been living in. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of my studio apartment in Millbrook Heights, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that creaked with every step. I hadn't slept. Not really. The funeral reception had ended at midnight, and I'd spent the hours since then sitting in the same worn leather chair that Evelisse used to curl up in when she'd visit, reading philosophy books while I worked on my laptop at the kitchen table. She'd been gone for exactly 18 hours. The knock came at 7:47 a.m. sharp, authoritative, the kind that demanded immediate attention. I knew who it was before I opened the door. Evelisse's parents, Eldrick and Cordelia Norshire, stood in the hallway flanked by her brother Jasper and sister-in-law Millicent. Behind them, stacked against the far wall, were moving boxes. Lots of them. "Rowick," Eldrick said, not bothering with pleasantries. He was a tall man with silver hair that always looked professionally styled, even at this ungodly hour. "We need to discuss the practical arrangements." I stepped aside to let them in. They moved through my small space like inspectors evaluating a property they already planned to demolish. Cordelia's nose wrinkled as she took in the IKEA furniture, the books stacked on milk crates, the single coffee maker that had seen better days. Millicent didn't even try to hide her disgust as she spotted the air mattress I'd been sleeping on since selling my bed to help pay for Evelisse's final medical treatments. "This is exactly what we were afraid of," Cordelia murmured to her husband, though her voice was deliberately loud enough for me to hear. She was supporting him this whole time. Jasper walked over to the window that overlooked the parking lot, where delivery trucks were already making their morning rounds. "Look, Rowick, we appreciate everything you did for our sister during her illness, really, we do. But now that she's gone, it's time to be realistic about your situation." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I walked to the kitchen and started making coffee. The ritual gave me something to focus on while they continued their inspection of my life. The measuring of grounds, the precise amount of water, the steady drip that filled the silence they clearly expected me to break with gratitude or desperation. "The medical bills alone must have wiped you out," Millicent added, running her finger along my bookshelf and examining the dust. "We've already spoken to the funeral director about transferring the remaining costs to our account. You won't need to worry about that debt." That was their first mistake, assuming I couldn't afford my wife's funeral. Eldrick cleared his throat and moved to what he apparently considered the head of my living room, positioning himself between me and the rest of his family like he was preparing to deliver a verdict. "We've found you a nice efficiency apartment in Clearwater District, much more affordable for someone in your situation. The security deposit is paid, first month's rent covered. You can move in this weekend." I poured my coffee slowly, added a splash of the expensive cream Evelisse had always insisted on keeping in my refrigerator. It was probably the only thing in this apartment that cost more than $10. "That's very generous," I said quietly. Cordelia's face softened for the first time since they'd arrived. "We're not trying to be cruel, dear. But surely you understand that without Evelisse's income from the family trust, your financial situation is rather precarious. She was always too generous for her own good, helping you with rent and expenses. Now that she's gone, those arrangements naturally conclude." Their second mistake, assuming Evelisse had been paying my bills. I took a long sip of coffee and studied their faces. Eldrick wore the expression of a man delivering difficult news he didn't enjoy but knew was necessary. Cordelia looked sympathetic but determined, like a doctor explaining why an amputation was the only way to save the patient. Jasper seemed uncomfortable, fidgeting with his phone, while Millicent continued her inventory of my possessions with barely concealed contempt. They had no idea that I'd been quietly paying for Evelisse's experimental treatments out of my own accounts. No idea that the struggling writer they dismissed for 3 years had been supporting their daughter through the most expensive medical care available. No idea that the modest lifestyle I maintained in this apartment was a choice, not a limitation. "I appreciate the concern," I said, settling into my chair, "but I think there might be some misunderstanding about Evelisse's financial arrangements." Aldrich waved his hand dismissively. "Son, I've been managing family finances for 40 years. Evelisse was receiving monthly distributions from the Norshire Family Trust. Those distributions supported both of you. Now that she's passed, those funds revert to the estate, which means they're no longer available for your living expenses." I nodded thoughtfully. "The trust distributions? Right, those were about $4,000 a month, if I remember correctly." "Exactly," Cordelia said, clearly relieved that I was being reasonable. "So you can see why maintaining this lifestyle isn't sustainable for you anymore." Their third mistake, assuming I didn't know the actual numbers. The trust distributions had been $4,000 a month, but what they didn't know was that Evelisse had been putting that money directly into savings for the past 2 years, ever since I'd started covering all our living expenses. What they also didn't know was that $4,000 was roughly what I made in a single day from the pharmaceutical royalties I'd inherited from my late uncle's research patents. I walked over to the window where Jasper was still standing, looking down at the modest parking lot where my 10-year-old Honda sat next to delivery trucks and economy cars. "You know what I find interesting?" I said, joining him at the window. "Everyone always assumes they understand other people's financial situations based on appearances." Jasper glanced at me nervously. "What do you mean?" I pointed toward the street beyond the parking lot, where expensive cars occasionally passed through this working-class neighborhood on their way to somewhere more prestigious. Take that Tesla, for instance. Beautiful car, probably costs more than most people make in a year. But do you know what's really expensive? Privacy, anonymity, the ability to live exactly how you want without people making assumptions about your worth based on your zip code. The room had gone quiet. I could feel them all watching me, trying to figure out if there was a deeper meaning to my words or if I was just making conversation. Millicent broke the silence. "Rowick, we understand this is difficult, but denial won't make the practical realities go away. Evelisse is gone, and with her, the financial support she was providing. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can start rebuilding your life." I turned back to face them, coffee cup still in hand. "You're absolutely right about one thing. Evelisse is gone, and everything is different now." I walked over to my bookshelf and pulled out a manila folder that had been wedged between 2 philosophy texts, which is why we should probably review the arrangements she made before she died. Aldrich's eyebrows rose slightly. "Arrangements?" I opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. 3 months ago, when it became clear that her condition was terminal, Evelisse asked me to meet with her attorney. She wanted to make sure certain things were handled properly after she passed. I handed the paper to Aldrich. As his eyes scanned the document, his confident expression began to shift. First confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked like panic. "This can't be right," he whispered. Cordelia moved to look over his shoulder. "What is it?" Jasper and Millicent crowded around them, and I watched their faces change as they read the document that would alter everything they thought they knew about their daughter's life and my place in it. It was just a simple transfer document, clean, legal, notarized, but it represented the complete restructuring of everything they'd assumed about power, money, and who had been supporting whom. "I don't understand," Cordelia said, her voice barely audible. "This says that she transferred the Thornwick Bay property to you. That's impossible. That property has been in our family for generations." I finished my coffee and set the cup down on the table. "Actually, that's just page 1, I said quietly. "There are 17 more pages covering the investment portfolios, the trust restructuring, and the pharmaceutical royalties." The boxes in the hallway suddenly seemed very premature. 6 months before Evelisse died, we were sitting by the lake behind the Thornwick Bay estate, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. She was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her frame already diminished by the illness that was slowly claiming her, but her eyes were as sharp and determined as ever. "They still think you're after our money," she said, not looking at me but keeping her gaze fixed on the water. Even after 3 years of marriage, they're convinced you're some kind of opportunist who trapped their daughter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was working on my laptop responding to emails from pharmaceutical companies interested in licensing modifications to my uncle's research. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. While her family worried about me accessing their modest trust fund, I was negotiating royalty payments that exceeded their annual family income. Let them think what they want, I replied, closing the laptop. Their opinion doesn't change anything between us. Evelisse turned to me with that expression she got when she was working through a complicated problem. She'd been a philosophy professor before the illness forced her to take leave, and she approached personal dilemmas the same way she approached academic questions, systematically, thoroughly, with careful consideration of all variables. "It bothers me more than it should," she said, "not for my sake but for yours. They treat you like you're invisible when you're in the same room. At family dinners, they talk about you like you're not there. My mother still introduces you as Evelisse's friend to people she's known for years." This was true. The Norshire family had elevated passive aggression to an art form. They never directly insulted me, never created scenes or confrontations. Instead, they employed a sophisticated system of exclusion, dismissal, and subtle undermining that was designed to make me feel unwelcome without giving me anything concrete to object to. At Christmas gatherings, they'd discuss expensive vacation plans without asking if we'd like to join, then express surprise when we didn't seem enthusiastic about their destination choices. They'd plan family business meetings at restaurants they knew I couldn't afford, then offer to cover my portion in a tone that made it clear this was an act of charity rather than inclusion. The most painful part wasn't their treatment of me, though. It was watching how it affected Evelisse. She'd grown up in that family, understood their language of conditional love and performance-based acceptance. When they excluded me, they were sending her a message too, that her judgment was questionable. Her choice in partners was disappointing. Her ability to recognize appropriate social boundaries was compromised. "You know what's really bothering you," I said, moving my chair closer to hers. "It's not that they don't respect me. It's that their disrespect for me is actually disrespect for you disguised as concern." She was quiet for a long time, watching a pair of ducks navigate the evening currents near the shoreline. "My grandmother used to tell me that money reveals character, but not in the way most people think. She said that how people treat others based on perceived wealth or poverty tells you everything you need to know about their values." That conversation happened on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she'd called her attorney. I learned this later, of course. At the time, I knew only that she'd been spending more time on phone calls with her legal and financial advisors, having conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. I assumed she was updating her will or making arrangements for her medical care. I never imagined the scope of what she was planning. The first hint came when she asked me to meet with Dr. Harrison Velmont, her family's longtime attorney. He had an office in downtown Thornwick Bay, all dark wood and leather-bound legal texts, the kind of place that charged by the hour for sitting in the waiting room. "Mrs. Calvane has asked me to review some financial arrangements with you," he said, sliding a thick folder across his mahogany desk. "These documents require your signature, but I want to make sure you understand the implications of what you're agreeing to." Inside the folder were property transfer documents, investment account authorizations, and trust restructuring papers. Page after page of legal language that essentially boiled down to one simple fact. Evelisse was systematically moving every asset she owned into my name. "I don't understand," I said, looking up from the papers. "Why is she doing this?" Dr. Velmont leaned back in his chair, studying me with the expression of a man who'd spent 40 years evaluating people's motives and character. "Mrs. Calvane seems to believe that her family will attempt to contest certain aspects of her estate after she passes. This arrangement removes those assets from probate entirely, making them impossible to challenge legally." The scope of what she was transferring was staggering. The Thornwick Bay estate, worth approximately $2.8 million. Investment portfolios managed by 3 different firms, totaling just over $5.4 million. And then there were the pharmaceutical royalties, income streams from her great-uncle's research that generated between $80,000 and $120,000 monthly. "She's essentially making you independently wealthy," Dr. Velmont continued, But more than that, she's ensuring that her family cannot use financial pressure to control or influence you after she's gone. I stared at the documents, trying to process the magnitude of what Evelisse was proposing. This seems extreme, I said finally. Surely there are other ways to handle whatever concerns she has about her family. Dr. Valmont smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Mr. Calvane, I've been the Norshire family attorney for 37 years. I've handled 3 generations of their legal affairs, including 2 previous estate disputes that turned quite ugly. Mrs. Calvane isn't being extreme, she's being realistic. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out another folder, this one much thinner. These are copies of correspondence between various family members over the past 18 months. Mrs. Calvane asked me to share them with you so you'd understand the context for her decision. The letters were brutal in their clinical assessment of my character and intentions. Jasper had written to his parents suggesting they hire a private investigator to, quote, verify Rowick's background and financial history. Millicent had sent a detailed email analyzing my, quote, fortune-hunting behavior and recommending they, quote, take steps to protect family assets from potential exploitation. But the most devastating document was a formal letter from Aldrich to his daughter, dated just 2 months after our wedding. In it, he expressed his about my influence on her judgment and suggested that her illness might be affecting her ability to recognize manipulative behavior from people seeking to take advantage of her vulnerable condition. They're planning to contest whatever inheritance you might receive, Dr. Valmont explained. They've already consulted with the state attorneys about grounds for challenging her mental competency at the time she drafted her will. By transferring these assets now, while she's demonstrably competent, she eliminates their ability to make such challenges. I signed the documents, but not because of the money. I signed them because I finally understood what Evelisse had been trying to protect. Not her assets, but her autonomy. Her right to make her own decisions about her life and her relationships without having those decisions second-guessed by people who'd never bothered to understand either of us. The transfers were completed over the following 6 weeks. Bank accounts, property deeds, investment portfolios, royalty agreements. Everything quietly moved from her name to mine through a series of legal transactions that attracted no attention and required no family notification. By the time she died, Evelisse Norshire Calvane owned almost nothing on paper. Everything she'd inherited, everything she'd built, everything that represented 3 generations of family wealth, now belonged to the poor man her family was already planning to evict from her life. The beautiful irony was that they would discover this not through careful investigation or legal maneuvering, but through their own arrogance. Their assumption that they could simply appear at my door with moving boxes and charitable offers of assistance, never imagining that the man they were trying to rescue might not need rescuing at all. I met Evelisse at a coffee shop called The Literary Grind in downtown Thornwick Bay on a rainy Thursday morning in March. I was there working on revisions to a research paper about pharmaceutical patent law, surrounded by printouts and legal documents that made me look like either a very organized law student or a very disorganized attorney. She was at the next table, grading what appeared to be philosophy papers, making notes in the margins with a fountain pen that seemed impractical for the task but perfectly suited to her careful, deliberate approach to everything. She looked up when I accidentally knocked over my coffee cup, sending lukewarm liquid across my papers and onto the floor between our tables. Kant or Kierkegaard? She asked, helping me gather the soggy documents. I'm sorry? Your papers. Based on the level of frustration you seem to be experiencing, I'm guessing you're wrestling with either categorical imperatives or existential authenticity. She smiled, and something in my chest shifted in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine or embarrassment. Patent law, actually, I said, accepting the napkin she offered, though I'm beginning to think existential philosophy might be more straightforward. That conversation lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, I'd learned that she was Dr. Evelisse Norshire, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Thornwick College, specializing in ethics and moral reasoning. She'd learned that I was Rowick Calvane, freelance researcher and consultant, working on intellectual property issues for pharmaceutical companies. What neither of us mentioned that first day were the assumptions we'd both made. She assumed I was probably a graduate student, given my age and apparent financial constraints. I'd ordered the cheapest item on the menu and seemed genuinely grateful when she offered to buy the second round of coffee. I assumed she came from money, given her confidence, her clothes, and the easy way she'd chosen the expensive bakery items without checking prices. We were both right, and both completely wrong. Our second meeting was intentional. She'd suggested lunch at a small restaurant near the college, the kind of place that catered to professors and serious students rather than tourists. Over sandwiches and iced tea, we talked about everything except money, family, or personal history. Philosophy, current events, books we'd read, places we'd traveled. The conversation was easy, natural, free from the careful navigation that characterized most of my social interactions. I didn't mention the monthly royalty payments that had been supporting me since my uncle's death 3 years earlier. She didn't mention the family trust fund, or the estate, or the fact that she was one of the wealthiest single women in the county. We were just two people enjoying each other's company, talking about ideas and possibilities, without the complications that money brings to every relationship. This lasted exactly 6 weeks. The first mention of her family came when she invited me to her apartment, a beautiful space in a converted Victorian mansion near the college, filled with books and original artwork, the kind of place that whispered of old money and quiet privilege. I was admiring a small oil painting that hung near her kitchen when she said, casually, "That's one of my great-aunt's pieces." She was quite talented, though the family never took her art seriously. "Your family has strong opinions about career choices?" I asked. Evelisse's expression changed, became more guarded. "My family has strong opinions about everything, particularly regarding people's motivations and character assessments." That should have been my warning. The first meeting with the Norscher family happened 2 months later, at their invitation to Sunday dinner at the family estate. I borrowed a friend's car. My Honda seemed inappropriate for the occasion, and spent 30 minutes in department stores trying to find clothes that would strike the right balance between respectful and authentic. The Thornwick Bay estate was everything I'd expected and more. Sprawling grounds, immaculate landscaping, a house that managed to be both impressive and welcoming. Aldrich Norscher met me at the front door with a firm handshake and the kind of smile that politicians use when meeting constituents they'll never see again. "So you're the young man Evelisse has been telling us about," he said, guiding me into a living room that could have been featured in architectural magazines. "She tells us you work in research." "Intellectual property consulting, primarily pharmaceutical patents," I replied. Cordelia Norscher emerged from what I assumed was the kitchen, elegant in the way that only comes from generations of social training. "How interesting," she said in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "That must be quite challenging financially, given the competitive nature of academic research." The first mistake I made was not correcting her assumption that I was struggling financially. The second mistake was not recognizing that this wasn't a casual observation but an opening gambit in a much larger game. Dinner was a masterclass in polite interrogation. Where had I grown up? A modest suburb outside the city. What had my parents done for work? My father had been a mechanic, my mother a school secretary. Did I have plans to pursue more stable employment? I was content with my current consulting arrangement. How had I met Evelisse? At a coffee shop, working on research projects. Each question was perfectly reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a comprehensive assessment designed to establish my social class, financial prospects, and potential motivations for pursuing their daughter. Jasper, Evelisse's younger brother, was more direct. Over dessert he asked, "So what's your long-term career plan?" "I mean, consulting is great for flexibility, but it must be difficult to build wealth or establish security in that kind of freelance arrangement." I explained that I was comfortable with my current income and enjoyed the independence that consulting provided. This was true, if incomplete. What I didn't mention was that my consulting generated more annual income than most people earned in 5 years, or that the pharmaceutical royalties provided more security than any traditional employment could offer. Millicent, Jasper's wife, was perhaps the most revealing in her approach. After dinner, while the others were discussing family business in the living room, she cornered me in the kitchen under the pretense of helping with dishes. "It must be wonderful being with someone like Evelisse," she said, her voice warm but her eyes calculating. "She's always been so generous, so willing to help people who are working hard to improve their circumstances." I stopped drying the plate I was holding and looked at her directly. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, nothing specific," she said quickly. "It's just that Evelisse has always had such a big heart. Sometimes too big, if you know what I mean." She's the kind of person who would give away everything she had to help someone she cared about. That was the moment I understood that this wasn't about getting to know me or welcoming me into their family. This was about establishing a narrative in which I was the beneficiary of Evelisse's charity, a financial burden she'd taken on out of misplaced compassion. The drive home was quiet. Evelisse seemed lost in thought, and I was processing the realization that her family had already decided who I was and what I represented to their daughter. Nothing I could say or do would change their fundamental assumption that I was a fortune hunter, because that assumption served their needs in ways that had nothing to do with me. "They think I'm using you for money," I said finally. Evelisse sighed. "They think everyone is using someone for money. It's how they understand relationships." "Does it bother you?" She was quiet for a long time, staring out at the streetlights passing by the window. "What bothers me is that they can't imagine any other reason someone would want to be with me." That conversation, 6 months into our relationship, was the beginning of my education in the Norshire family dynamics. Love, in their world, was always transactional. Affection was always conditional. And anyone who couldn't contribute financially to the family's status and security was automatically suspect. Over the following months, as our relationship deepened and eventually led to marriage, I watched their suspicion transform into active hostility. They couldn't openly object to me. I was never rude, never inappropriate, never gave them legitimate grounds for complaint. But they could make it clear, through 1,000 small gestures and comments, that I would never be truly welcome in their family. They were protecting their daughter, they believed, from a man who saw her as a meal ticket rather than a partner. The irony was devastating. While they worried about me accessing their family money, I was quietly supporting both of us through income streams they never imagined existed. But perhaps the greatest irony was yet to come. Their determination to protect Evelisse from my alleged financial predation would ultimately result in her transferring every asset she owned directly to me, ensuring that their worst fears about my intentions would become reality. Not because I'd manipulated her, but because they'd made it clear that the only way to protect our relationship was to remove their ability to interfere with it financially. The morning after I showed the Norshire family the first page of Evelisse's asset transfer, my apartment felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, but because the power dynamics that had governed my relationship with her family for 3 years had shifted completely. They left in stunned silence, promising to review this matter with their attorney and ensure that proper procedures had been followed. I knew they would spend the next several days trying to understand what had happened and, more importantly, trying to find ways to undo it. I was right. The first probe came from Millicent on Wednesday morning. She called my apartment at 8:15 a.m., her voice carefully modulated to sound casual and concerned rather than investigative. "Rowick, I hope you don't mind me calling," she began. "I wanted to check on how you're handling everything. Grief can be so disorienting, and sometimes we make decisions that seem reasonable in the moment, but might not be in our best interest long term." I was making coffee, watching the morning commuters through my kitchen window. "I appreciate the concern," I said. "I'm managing as well as can be expected." Of course, and please understand, we're not questioning your relationship with Evelisse or suggesting anything inappropriate happened. But these legal documents you showed us, they're quite complex, and we want to make sure you fully understand the implications of what you've inherited." There it was. The word inherited rather than received or been given. In their minds, this was still fundamentally about death and estate law, rather than conscious decision-making by a living person. "I think Evelisse was very clear about her intentions," I replied. "But that's just it," Millicent continued, her voice gaining urgency. "We've been reviewing family records, and some of these assets, particularly the Thornwick Bay property, have very specific restrictions about transfer outside the family. There may be legal complications that weren't properly addressed." This was their first strategy, suggest that the transfers were somehow invalid due to technical legal issues. I'd expected this approach, which is why I'd spent Tuesday afternoon on the phone with Dr. Valmont, reviewing every document to ensure that all procedures had been followed correctly. "I'm confident that Evelisse's attorney handled everything appropriately," I said. "But if you have specific concerns about legal compliance, perhaps you should discuss them with him directly." The pause on the other end of the line told me that they'd already tried this approach and been politely but firmly rebuffed by Dr. Valmont's office. "Well, yes, of course," Millicent said. "We'll certainly be following up on that. But in the meantime, we thought it might be helpful to arrange a family meeting to discuss how these changes might affect everyone involved." A family meeting. Translation, an intervention designed to pressure me into voluntarily returning assets that they couldn't legally reclaim. That's thoughtful, I said. But I think I need some time to process Evelisse's death before making any major decisions about the arrangements she put in place. After I hung up, I realized that this was just the beginning. Over the next week, I received similar calls from Jasper, focusing on the emotional burden of managing so much responsibility while grieving. Cordelia, emphasizing the family history connected to these assets and how important it was to preserve that legacy. And finally, Aldrich himself, taking a more businesslike approach, suggesting we optimize the financial structures to benefit everyone involved. Each conversation followed the same pattern: expressions of concern for my well-being, acknowledgement that Evelisse had clearly cared about me, and then carefully worded suggestions that I might be happier and more secure with a simpler arrangement that would relieve me of the burden of managing such complex assets. They weren't offering to buy the assets from me or suggesting that I'd acquired them illegally. They were trying to convince me that owning them would be harmful to my own interests, that I'd be better off with a smaller, more manageable inheritance supplemented by their ongoing family support. It was sophisticated psychological manipulation disguised as compassionate concern. The second strategy emerged Friday afternoon when Jasper showed up at my apartment unannounced, carrying a bottle of expensive whiskey and wearing the expression of a man about to have a difficult but necessary conversation. "I thought you might appreciate some company," he said, settling into the chair across from my kitchen table. "This week has been hell for all of us, but it must be especially difficult for you, dealing with all these legal complications on top of everything else." He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and pushed one toward me. "I want you to know that despite our differences over the years, I've always respected your relationship with my sister. She was happy with you, and that mattered to our family." The past tense was deliberate. Their relationship was over. Now it was time to deal with practical realities. "I appreciate that," I said, not touching the whiskey. "The thing is," Jasper continued, "these asset transfers Evelisse arranged. They're going to create problems you probably haven't considered. Tax implications, for instance. The IRS is going to treat these as gifts rather than inheritance, which means you're looking at substantial tax liability. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes owed on assets you can't easily liquidate." This was more sophisticated than their previous approaches. Rather than questioning the legal validity of the transfers or appealing to my emotions, he was suggesting that owning these assets would create financial problems I couldn't handle. "Additionally," he went on, "there are ongoing maintenance costs, property taxes, management fees for the investment accounts. The Thornwick Bay estate alone costs about $15,000 monthly to maintain properly. Without additional income sources, these assets could become a significant financial burden rather than a benefit." I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. "You've put a lot of thought into this." "We all have," he admitted. "Look, Rowick, we're not trying to cheat you or take away something that's rightfully yours. But we're also not going to stand by and watch you get crushed under the weight of financial obligations you're not equipped to handle." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "We've had our attorneys draft a proposal that we think addresses everyone's interests fairly. You'd retain ownership of a significant portion of the liquid assets, enough to ensure your financial security for life, while transferring the more complex holdings back to family management. You'd still benefit from the income these assets generate, but without the liability and administrative burden of direct ownership." I opened the folder and scanned the documents. The proposal was elegant in its apparent fairness. I would keep approximately $1.2 million in easily managed investments, while transferring the estate, the pharmaceutical royalties, and the more complex financial instruments back to family control. In exchange, I would receive quarterly distributions equivalent to about 60% of what these assets currently generated. On paper, it looked reasonable. I would still be wealthy by most standards, still financially independent, still able to live comfortably without working. But I would also be permanently dependent on the Norsher family's goodwill for my ongoing financial security. "This is quite generous," I said, closing the folder. Jasper's face brightened. "We tried to structure it in a way that honors Evelisse's intentions while also being practical for everyone involved." "I'm curious about one thing," I continued. "How long did it take your attorneys to prepare this proposal?" "I'm not sure I understand." "Well, Evelisse died 6 days ago. I showed your family the transfer documents 4 days ago. This proposal is quite detailed. with complex legal language and specific financial projections. It would have taken considerable time to research, draft, and review. Jasper's expression shifted slightly. We wanted to be prepared to help you navigate these complicated issues. So you began preparing this proposal before you knew what assets had been transferred to me, which means you were planning to make this kind of offer regardless of what Evelisse had actually done. The silence stretched between us. Finally, Jasper picked up his glass and took a long drink. "Rowick, I think you're overanalyzing this. We're trying to help." "I'm sure you are," I said. "But I think I need to understand exactly what kind of help you have in mind before I make any decisions." That evening, after Jasper left with his unsigned proposal, I called Dr. Velmont's office and requested an emergency consultation. We met Saturday morning in his office, where I described the various approaches the Norsher family had taken over the past week. "They're being quite methodical," he observed. "Legal challenges, emotional appeals, practical concerns, and now financial restructuring proposals. They're covering all possible angles." "What's their endgame?" I asked. Dr. Velmont leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mr. Calvane, I've been practicing estate law for 4 decades. I've seen family disputes destroy relationships, bankrupt estates, and ruin lives. What the Norsher family is doing isn't unusual, but it is dangerous." He pulled out a thick file from his cabinet. "These are documents from a similar case I handled 15 years ago. A wealthy widow married a man her family disapproved of. When she died, she left everything to her husband. The family spent 3 years and nearly $500,000 in legal fees trying to overturn her will. They didn't succeed, but they made that man's life so difficult that he eventually agreed to a settlement just to end the harassment. You think that's their strategy? I think they're hoping you'll conclude that fighting them isn't worth the stress and expense, even if you're legally in the right." He closed the file. "The question is, what are you prepared to do to protect what Evelisse gave you?" That night, I sat in my apartment reviewing everything that had happened since the funeral. The coordinated phone calls, the carefully timed visit from Jasper, the pre-prepared legal proposal. It was clear that the Norsher family had developed a comprehensive strategy to reclaim the assets Evelisse had transferred to me. They were counting on my grief, my presumed financial inexperience, and my desire to avoid conflict to make me receptive to their generous offer. They assumed that a simple man from a working-class background would be overwhelmed by the complexity of managing substantial wealth and grateful for their expert guidance. What they didn't realize was that I'd been quietly managing pharmaceutical royalties worth millions of dollars for 3 years. I understood complex financial instruments, tax implications, and estate planning strategies better than they imagined. And most importantly, I understood exactly why Evelisse had gone to such lengths to ensure these assets couldn't be reclaimed by her family after her death. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls. First, to a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud cases. Second, to a tax attorney who had experience with high-value asset transfers. Third, to a security company that provided protection services for individuals involved in estate disputes. If the Norsher family wanted to play a sophisticated game, I was prepared to match their level of sophistication. But unlike them, I wasn't interested in negotiation or compromise. I was interested in making sure they understood that their daughter's final wishes would be honored, regardless of how much pressure they were prepared to apply. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. in the conference room of Hartwell & Associates, a prestigious law firm in downtown Thornwick Bay that specialized in estate and family law. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing the only suit I owned, a charcoal gray outfit I'd purchased for job interviews 3 years earlier and had worn exactly twice since then. The Norsher family was already assembled when I entered the conference room. Aldrich and Cordelia sat on one side of the polished mahogany table, flanked by Jasper and Millicent. Across from them sat 2 attorneys I didn't recognize, along with Dr. Velmont, who nodded professionally when I took my seat. The lead attorney, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that comes from winning more cases than you lose, introduced herself as Margaret Hartwell. "Mr. Calvane, thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I understand there are some questions about the asset transfers your late wife arranged before her death." "Actually," I said, placing my own folder on the table, "I requested this meeting to address some concerns about the family's response to those transfers." The room went quiet. This wasn't the opening they'd expected. Margaret Hartwell recovered quickly. "Of course. Perhaps we should begin by reviewing the documents in question to ensure everyone understands the current legal situation." She opened her briefcase and removed a thick stack of papers. We've conducted a preliminary review of the transfers Mrs. Calvane executed in the months before her death. While the documents appear to be technically valid, there are several issues that warrant discussion. She slid copies of the papers toward me. First, there's the matter of timing. These transfers occurred during a period when Mrs. Calvane was receiving intensive medical treatment for a terminal illness. Courts have sometimes questioned the mental competency of individuals making significant financial decisions under such circumstances. I didn't touch the papers. Are you suggesting that Evelisse was mentally incompetent when she made these decisions? Not necessarily, Margaret replied carefully, but the combination of illness, pain, medication, and emotional stress can affect judgment in ways that aren't immediately apparent. We want to ensure that her true intentions are honored, not decisions that might have been influenced by her medical condition. Aldrich leaned forward. What Ms. Hartwell is saying, Rowick, is that we need to consider whether Evelisse was thinking clearly when she made such drastic changes to her estate planning. I opened my folder and removed a single sheet of paper. That's interesting, because I have here a letter from Dr. Patricia Morrison, the oncologist who treated Evelisse throughout her illness. Dr. Morrison states that at no point during her treatment was Evelisse's cognitive function impaired by her medication or condition. In fact, she specifically notes that Evelisse was unusually clear and decisive about her personal affairs right up until her final week. Margaret's expression tightened slightly. Medical opinions can vary, and physicians don't always recognize subtle changes in decision-making capacity. I removed another document from my folder. I also have a psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Robert Chin, a neuropsychologist who specializes in cognitive assessments for estate planning purposes. Evelisse requested this evaluation specifically to establish her mental competency at the time she was making these transfers. Dr. Chin's report confirms that her cognitive function was entirely normal and that she fully understood the implications of her decisions. The silence in the room was deafening. Clearly, they hadn't expected me to have anticipated this line of attack or to have prepared such comprehensive documentation. Cordelia spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Rowick, we're not questioning your relationship with our daughter or suggesting that you influenced her inappropriately, but surely you can understand our concern about such significant assets leaving the family, especially when there may be more suitable arrangements that would benefit everyone. I turned to face her directly. Mrs. Norsher, what would you consider a suitable arrangement? Jasper pulled out the folder he'd brought to my apartment the previous week. Actually, we've prepared a proposal that we think addresses everyone's interests fairly. He slid the documents across the table. This would allow you to retain substantial financial benefits while ensuring that family assets remain under appropriate management. I glanced at the proposal without opening it. This is the same offer Mr. Norsher brought to my apartment last week. The one that would give me about $1.2 million while transferring approximately $8 million worth of assets back to family control. Margaret looked surprised. You've already reviewed this proposal? I've done more than review it, I said. I've had it analyzed by independent attorneys and financial advisors. Would you like to hear their assessment? Without waiting for an answer, I removed another document from my folder. According to this analysis, your proposal would result in me receiving approximately 15% of the value of the assets Evelisse transferred to me, while the family retains control of 85% of those assets. The quarterly distributions you're offering would be subject to family discretion and could be modified or terminated at any time. I looked around the table at their faces. In other words, you're asking me to voluntarily give up nearly $7 million in exchange for a promise of ongoing payments that you could revoke whenever you choose. Aldrich's face had gone red. That's a gross mischaracterization of our proposal. We're offering you financial security for life, along with relief from the burden of managing complex assets you're not qualified to handle. Interesting that you mention qualifications, I said, removing the final document from my folder, because I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about my background and capabilities. I handed copies of the document to everyone at the table. This is a summary of my financial history over the past 5 years, prepared by the same accounting firm that manages your family's investments. Margaret read the first page, her eyebrows rising steadily. Mr. Calvane, this indicates that you've been managing pharmaceutical royalties worth several $1 million annually. It also shows investment income, consulting fees, and asset management activities that suggest considerable financial sophistication. That's correct, I said. I've been financially independent since inheriting intellectual property rights from my uncle 4 years ago. The income from those royalties has been supporting both Evelisse and me throughout our marriage." The room was completely silent now. I could see them processing this information, realizing that all their assumptions about my financial situation and capabilities were not just wrong, but completely inverted. "So when Mrs. Norsher expressed concern about me being a financial burden on your daughter, she had it exactly backwards. I was supporting Evelisse, not the other way around." Cordelia's voice was barely a whisper. "That's impossible. Evelisse was receiving monthly distributions from the family trust." "Yes, she was. And she was depositing those distributions directly into savings accounts because all our living expenses were being covered by my income." I turned to face Aldrich. "When you worried about me accessing family money, I was already earning more annually than your entire family trust generates." Jasper looked stunned. "But you live in that tiny apartment, drive that old car, dress like someone who's struggling financially." "I live modestly because I choose to, not because I have to. Some people prefer privacy and simplicity over displays of wealth." Margaret Hartwell was studying the financial documents with professional interest. "Mr. Calvane, if these numbers are accurate, you have substantial independent wealth. Why would Mrs. Calvane feel it necessary to transfer additional assets to you?" I looked directly at Aldrich and Cordelia, because she understood that her family would try to use financial pressure to control me after she died. She knew that even if I could afford to fight legal challenges, the emotional cost of constant conflict would be devastating while I was grieving her loss. I stood up, leaving the documents on the table. Evelisse transferred those assets to me not because she thought I needed the money, but because she wanted to ensure that I could honor her memory and our relationship without having to defend my right to do so against people who never accepted me as part of her life. Aldrich finally found his voice. "You could have told us about your financial situation. You could have corrected our assumptions." "You never asked about my financial situation," I replied. "You assumed I was poor based on my appearance and lifestyle, then spent 3 years treating me like a charity case and a potential threat. When I didn't correct those assumptions, it confirmed everything you wanted to believe about my character and motivations." I walked toward the door, then turned back to face them. "The asset transfers Evelisse arranged are legal, properly documented, and will stand up to any challenge you want to make. But more importantly, they represent her final statement about who she trusted to honor her memory and protect what mattered to her." Margaret Hartwell cleared her throat. "Mr. Calvane, perhaps we could discuss some kind of compromise arrangement that would address the family's concerns while recognizing your legitimate interests." I opened the door and looked back at the conference table, where 4 people sat in stunned silence, their carefully prepared strategy in ruins around them. "Miss Hartwell, the only compromise I'm interested in is the one Evelisse already made. She found a way to ensure that her assets would be managed by someone who loved her for herself, not her money. That arrangement isn't open to negotiation." As I walked out of the conference room, I could hear angry voices beginning to rise behind me. But for the first time since Evelisse's death, I felt something approaching peace. The truth was finally out in the open, and the games could stop. The only question remaining was how far the Norsher family would be willing to go to challenge a decision that was no longer reversible, made by someone they could no longer intimidate or manipulate. The answer to that question came faster than I expected. By Thursday morning, exactly 48 hours after the disastrous law office meeting, the Norsher family had regrouped and launched their most aggressive strategy yet. It began with a phone call from someone I'd never heard of. "Mr. Calvane, this is Detective Sarah Morrison with the Thornwick Bay Police Department," the voice said. "We've received a complaint regarding potential elder fraud and financial abuse. I need you to come in for questioning this afternoon." I set down my coffee cup carefully, processing what I'd just heard. "Elder fraud? A family has filed a complaint alleging that you may have used undue influence to manipulate an elderly, terminally ill woman into transferring substantial assets to you before her death. These are serious accusations, Mr. Calvane. I strongly recommend you bring an attorney." The Norsher family had decided that if they couldn't reclaim the assets through legal maneuvering or emotional pressure, they would try to criminalize my relationship with Evelisse. This strategy was elegant in its ruthlessness. By filing criminal complaints, they could force me to spend enormous amounts of money and time defending myself, even if the charges were ultimately baseless. I called Dr. Valmont immediately. They've reported me to the police for elder fraud, I said. There was a long pause. I was afraid this might happen. When families can't challenge estate transfers through civil courts, they sometimes try criminal accusations as a way to create pressure for settlement. Can they do that? Just file false criminal complaints? They can file complaints based on their genuine suspicions, Dr. Valmont said carefully. Whether those suspicions are reasonable or founded on actual evidence is something the police will have to determine. I hung up and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the modest neighborhood where I'd chosen to live despite having the means to afford much more. The irony wasn't lost on me. The family that had spent 3 years believing I was a financial predator had now decided to make that belief official. But what they didn't know was that I'd been expecting exactly this move for weeks. The day after Evelisse died, while they were planning their strategy to reclaim her assets, I'd been making preparations of my own. Not just legal preparations, but something more comprehensive. I'd hired Sterling Investigations, a firm that specialized in asset protection for high-net-worth individuals facing family disputes. The detective who'd handled my case was a former FBI agent named Rebecca Torres, who understood that when substantial money was involved, accusations and counter-accusations could get very complicated very quickly. At my request, she'd been quietly documenting everything. Every phone call from family members, every visit, every pressure tactic and manipulation attempt. But more importantly, she'd been investigating the Norshire family's own financial history. I called Rebecca from my apartment that Thursday morning. They filed criminal complaints, I told her. I know, she said. I've been monitoring police reports. Are you ready to activate the full response? Yes. Give me 2 hours. At exactly 3 p.m., I walked into the Thornwick Bay Police Department with Dr. Valmont and Rebecca Torres. Detective Morrison was waiting for us in a small interview room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant. Mr. Calvane, I appreciate you coming in voluntarily, she began. I need to ask you some questions about your relationship with Evelisse Norshire and the financial transfers she made before her death. Rebecca placed a thick folder on the table. Detective Morrison, before you begin questioning my client, I'd like to provide some context that might be relevant to your investigation. She opened the folder and removed a stack of photographs. These are surveillance photos taken over the past 2 weeks showing various members of the Norshire family meeting with individuals who have no apparent legitimate business with their family. The photo showed Aldrich and Jasper meeting with a man in an expensive suit outside a downtown restaurant. Millicent and Cordelia entering the office of what appeared to be a private investigation firm. Various family members having intense conversations in parking lots and coffee shops. We've identified these individuals, Rebecca continued. They include a former police detective who now works as a private investigator specializing in asset recovery, an attorney who has been sanctioned twice by the state bar for filing frivolous lawsuits, and a financial consultant who helps families challenge estate transfers. Detective Morrison studied the photos with growing interest. What exactly are you suggesting? Rebecca removed another set of documents. We're suggesting that the Norshire family has been conducting a coordinated campaign to pressure Mr. Calvane into voluntarily returning assets that were legally transferred to him by his deceased wife. When that pressure campaign failed, they escalated to filing criminal complaints as a way to force him into settlement negotiations. She handed Detective Morrison a thick stack of papers. These are transcripts of recorded phone calls between various family members discussing their strategy for reclaiming what they refer to as family assets. The conversations make it clear that they view the criminal complaints as a tactical maneuver rather than a genuine concern about elder abuse. I watched Detective Morrison's expression change as she read through the transcripts. There, in their own words, was evidence of exactly the kind of coordinated harassment that Rebecca had been documenting. How did you obtain these recordings? Detective Morrison asked. Mr. Calvane's apartment has been equipped with security systems since the day after his wife's funeral, Rebecca replied. Every phone call he's received, every visit, every conversation that occurred on his property has been legally recorded with appropriate notification. Several of these conversations took place in public spaces where recording is legal without consent. Dr. Valmont leaned forward. Detective Morrison, I think you'll find that the real story here isn't elder fraud. It's a wealthy family attempting to use the criminal justice system to recover assets they believe should have remained in their control. Rebecca removed one final document from her folder. This is a financial analysis conducted by the same accounting firm that manages the Norshire family's investments. It shows that Mr. Calvane has been financially supporting his wife throughout their marriage, not the other way around. The allegation that he manipulated her for financial gain is not just false, it's the exact opposite of what actually occurred. Detective Morrison set down the papers and looked at me directly. "Mr. Calvane, did you ever ask your wife to transfer assets to you?" "No," I said. "I learned about the transfers only when she asked me to meet with her attorney to sign the documents. I tried to talk her out of it, actually. I didn't want to create problems with her family." "Did you ever discuss her family's wealth or express interest in accessing their money?" "Detective Morrison, I earn more annually from pharmaceutical royalties than the entire Norshire family trust generates. I had no financial motive to manipulate my wife or anyone else." Rebecca added, "We've prepared a complete financial disclosure showing Mr. Calvane's income, assets, and spending patterns over the past 5 years. This investigation will show that he supported his wife financially, not the reverse." Detective Morrison closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. "Based on what you've shown me, it appears that the Norshire family may have filed these complaints in bad faith, as part of a larger strategy to pressure you into returning assets they can't legally reclaim." She looked at Rebecca. "I assume you'll be filing counter-complaints?" "Filing them this afternoon," Rebecca confirmed. "Harassment, filing false police reports, and civil conspiracy to interfere with lawful property ownership. We have documented evidence of all three." As we left the police station, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Evelisse's death, complete clarity about what came next. The Norshire family had made their final play, and it had backfired spectacularly. Instead of forcing me to defend against criminal charges, they'd provided me with evidence of their own criminal behavior. But the real victory wasn't legal or financial. It was the knowledge that Evelisse's final gift to me, the assets she'd transferred to ensure I could live independently of her family's approval or control, had served its purpose exactly as she'd intended. By Friday morning, the story was front-page news in the Thornwick Bay Tribune, wealthy family accused of filing false police reports in a state dispute. The article detailed the criminal complaints they'd filed, the evidence showing those complaints were part of a coordinated harassment campaign, and the countercharges now being filed against them. For 3 years, the Norshire family had treated me like a threat to be managed or eliminated. Now the entire community would understand exactly who the real threat had been. The newspaper article was just the beginning. By the following Monday, Rebecca Torres had assembled what she called the complete picture. A comprehensive investigation that revealed the Norshire family's behavior pattern extended far beyond their treatment of me. We met in her downtown office, a space that looked more like a high-tech command center than a traditional detective agency. Multiple monitors displayed financial records, legal documents, and surveillance footage. Rebecca had spent the weekend connecting dots that painted a disturbing pattern of manipulation and control. "The thing about families like the Norshires," she said, pulling up a detailed timeline on her main screen, "is that their methods become habitual. They don't just target one person with these tactics. They use them repeatedly on anyone they perceive as a threat to their financial interests." The timeline she'd created was shocking in its scope. Over the past 15 years, the Norshire family had been involved in 6 separate legal disputes with individuals who'd married into or been associated with their social circle. A business partner who'd been forced out of a profitable venture through coordinated legal pressure. A former estate manager who'd been accused of theft after questioning some of their financial practices. Even a previous family attorney who'd been subjected to professional complaints after refusing to participate in what he considered unethical behavior. "This pattern is what convinced me to take your case," Rebecca continued. "When wealthy families develop these systematic approaches to controlling people, they rarely stop with just one target." She clicked to another screen showing financial records. "But here's what's really interesting. While they were accusing you of financial manipulation, they've been engaged in some questionable financial practices themselves. The documents she'd uncovered told a story of deliberate asset concealment and trust fund manipulation that had been going on for years. Aldrich had been systematically moving family assets through a network of shell companies, apparently to avoid tax obligations and hide wealth from regulatory oversight. Jasper had been using his position as trust administrator to give himself and Millicent preferential access to family funds for personal investments. Most damaging was evidence that they'd been manipulating Evelisse's trust distributions, claiming she was receiving $4,000 monthly when she was actually entitled to nearly $8,000. The difference had been quietly redirected to accounts controlled by other family members. "They were stealing from your wife," Rebecca said simply. For at least 3 years before she died, they were systematically reducing her trust payments and using that money to fund their own expenses. I stared at the financial records, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and validation. Evelisse never mentioned this. She probably didn't know. The trust statements she received were falsified to show the lower amount. As far as she knew, $4,000 was her full monthly distribution. Rebecca pulled up another set of documents. But here's where it gets really interesting. 3 weeks before Evelisse died, she discovered the discrepancy. On the screen was a series of email exchanges between Evelisse and the trust's accounting firm. She'd requested a complete audit of her trust account after noticing some inconsistencies in her statements. The audit had revealed not only the missing monthly distributions but also evidence that family members had been using her trust as collateral for personal loans without her knowledge or consent. "That's why she transferred everything to you so quickly," Rebecca continued. "She wasn't just protecting you from their future interference. She was protecting her assets from their ongoing theft." The final piece of Rebecca's investigation was perhaps the most damning. She'd uncovered evidence that the Norshire family had hired the private investigator not just to build a case against me, but to locate and catalog all of Evelisse's assets before she died. They'd been planning to challenge any inheritance I might receive long before they knew what she'd actually left me. "The criminal complaints they filed against you were part of a strategy they'd developed months in advance," Rebecca explained. "They had this entire playbook ready to deploy against whoever ended up with assets they felt belonged to them." That afternoon, Dr. Valmont called an emergency meeting with District Attorney's office. The evidence Rebecca had assembled was serious enough to warrant a formal criminal investigation into the Norshire family's financial practices. District Attorney Patricia Kellner reviewed the documents with the kind of focused intensity that made it clear she understood the implications of what she was seeing. "This isn't just harassment or false reporting," she said. "We're looking at potential charges of trust fund fraud, tax evasion, and filing false documents with financial institutions." "What does that mean practically?" I asked. "It means the Norshire family is facing federal investigation by the IRS, state investigation by the Banking Commission, and potential criminal charges that could result in significant prison time for the primary actors." Dr. Valmont leaned forward. "District Attorney Kellner, my client's primary concern isn't punishment for the Norshire family. He simply wants to ensure they can't continue harassing him or challenging his wife's clearly expressed wishes." "I understand," she replied. "But when we discover evidence of systematic financial fraud, we have an obligation to pursue it regardless of the victim's preferences." That evening, I sat in my apartment trying to process how completely the situation had reversed. Just 2 weeks earlier, I'd been a grieving widower facing pressure from his in-laws to give up assets his wife had left him. Now those same in-laws were facing federal investigation and potential criminal charges. The irony was overwhelming. They'd spent 3 years treating me like a financial predator, never realizing that the real financial predator was sitting at their own family dinner table. While they worried about me accessing Evelisse's money, they'd been systematically stealing from her for years. But perhaps the most profound revelation was understanding the full depth of Evelisse's wisdom in her final months. She hadn't just transferred assets to protect me from their interference. She'd discovered their theft and moved quickly to prevent them from stealing anymore. The comprehensive nature of the transfers, the speed with which they'd been executed, the psychological evaluation she'd insisted upon, all of it made sense now. She'd been building a legal fortress not just to protect our relationship, but to expose and stop their criminal behavior. Rebecca called me that night with one final update. "The IRS audit begins Monday morning," she said. "The Banking Commission is freezing several of their accounts pending investigation, and the State Attorney General's office is opening a formal inquiry into trust fund fraud." "How long will this take?" I asked. "Criminal investigations like this typically take months or years. But here's the important thing. They can't continue pressuring you while they're dealing with their own legal problems. Their attention is going to be entirely focused on avoiding prison." For the first time since Evelisse died, I felt something approaching closure. Not just because the harassment had stopped, but because the truth about who she'd really been protecting me from was finally clear to everyone involved. 6 months later, I stood in the garden behind the Thornwick Bay estate on a warm September morning, watching contractors install the final pieces of the memorial library Evelisse had always dreamed of building. The Norshire family legal saga had concluded with plea agreements, substantial fines, and restitution payments that would fund philosophy scholarships for first-generation college students. Aldrich had received 2 years of probation for trust fund fraud. Jasper faced federal tax evasion charges that would likely result in prison time. Millicent had been banned from serving as a trustee or executor for any estate in the state. Cordelia, who'd been largely unaware of the men's financial schemes, had quietly moved to Florida to live with her sister. But more importantly, the investigation had revealed something that changed how I understood Evelisse's final months. Hidden in her personal papers, investigators found a journal she'd kept during her illness. The entries revealed that she'd suspected her family's financial manipulation for over a year, but had been gathering evidence carefully, methodically, the way she approached everything in life. Her final entry, dated just 3 days before she died, read, "R doesn't know that I'm not just protecting him from them. I'm protecting him for something greater. He has the heart to use these resources the way they should be used. Money in the hands of people who see it as power becomes a weapon. Money in the hands of people who see it as responsibility becomes a gift." The memorial library was my answer to her faith in me. Instead of simply managing inherited wealth, I'd used it to create something that honored both her memory and her values. The Evelisse Rowick Calvane Center for Ethical Philosophy would provide free access to philosophical education and host community discussions about moral reasoning and social responsibility. On opening day, I received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the oncologist who'd treated Evelisse, stopped by during the public tours. "She would have loved this," she said, standing in the reading room where Evelisse's favorite books lined the walls. "She talked about you often during her treatments. She said you were the first person she'd met who understood that wealth was a responsibility, not a privilege." As I locked up the library that evening, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The Norshire family had seen me as a threat, because they couldn't imagine that someone might love their daughter for herself rather than her money. But their suspicion had revealed more about their character than mine. True wealth, I'd learned, isn't measured by what you can accumulate, but by what you're willing to give away. Evelisse had given me everything, not because she wanted to make me rich, but because she trusted me to understand the difference between owning something and being worthy of it. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money at all. It's the faith someone places in your character, when they believe you'll use whatever you've been given to honor their memory and serve something larger than yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.